Welcome, everybody. We're live. This is the first in a series of free live LSAT classes here on YouTube. Over the coming days and weeks, I'll be running these live classes every single weekday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Pacific, in the absence of any holidays, vacations, anything of that nature. But for those of you joining now, welcome. If you're taking the LSAT in November, January, February, April, June, or beyond, this class is for you. Today, we're going to be covering how to overcome an LSAT score plateau. So this is for you if you've been studying for weeks, you've been drilling logical reasoning till your brain hurts, you've been taking 5, maybe 10 practice tests, but your score still has not moved. That pit in your stomach feeling right now, hoping you misread it. Nope, it's the same number as last week. And I get it. Every serious LSAT student hits that point. It's the point where you've been working harder than ever, but still nothing is changing. So let me take that weight off your shoulders. You're not broken. You haven't peaked yet. You've just hit what we call a plateau. What that really means is that your old strategies, the ones that got you from beginner to being decent, have officially stopped working, and you've outgrown those tactics. I mean, think about it like going to the gym. At first, everything works and everything gives you a lift. If you pick up a dumbbell, boom, that's progress. But after a few months, those same weights don't do as much anymore. It doesn't mean that you're getting weaker. It means that you're lifting the same thing over and over. And if you've hit a plateau in your LSAT prep, that's what's happening here. You might be working, going through the motions, but it's not really training anymore, just repeating. And so today in this free LSAT class, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to break out of that plateau. I'll show you how to find your hidden blind spots, how to practice the way that top scorers practice, and how to finally start seeing your score move again, even if you've been stuck for months. And no, it's not about taking 10 more practice tests or staying up till 2 a.m. doing drills. It's about fixing the system behind your studying. So here's how we're going to start. I want you to drop 2 numbers in the chat right now. First, your most recent practice test score, and secondly, your goal score. So maybe you're at a 150 and you want to hit 170. Maybe you're at a 165 and you want to hit a 175. Don't overthink it. Just type it in the chat. And by the end of this class today, I want you to be able to look at that goal number and actually believe it's realistic, not just some wishful thinking. So here's the big idea that changes everything. A plateau is not random. It's actually predictable. It's the result of 3 forces working together: blind spots, random practice, and weak review. When those multiply, when they compound, your score flattens no matter how hard you work. If you change any one of those factors, though, you will feel a small lift. And if you change all 3 of those factors, the ceiling breaks and you hit a new personal best. So first, let's talk about blind spots. Those are the patterns that you miss without even realizing it. Maybe it's necessary versus sufficient in logical reasoning. Maybe you're confusing the author's viewpoint with background context in reading comp. You don't see it, so you keep repeating it. And that's why it feels like you're running in place. The second factor is random practice. That's when you open up an LSAT prep textbook or a question bank and you drill some logical reasoning or some reading comp, some mixed, hoping the variety will automatically make you stronger. But it doesn't. You might get a lot of reps, but almost none of them are on the exact thing that's causing you to miss questions in the first place. The third factor is weak review. Most students look at the explanation, they nod along, and then they move on. But that's not review. Real review changes what you do tomorrow. And if your review doesn't end with one sentence you will use on the next question, that's not review, that's passively absorbing information. Now let's flip the equation. Imagine you do the opposite of those 3 things. You study with clarity, you do targeted reps, and you do structured review. That is your way out. And clarity means you can state your top two mistakes in plain English and describe exactly how they trick you. For example, in necessary assumption, I fall for answers that guarantee too much. I forget the negation test. Or in reading comp, I lose sight of the author's opinion when the passage includes a long quote, so I answer as if the quoted person is the author. If you can say it clearly, you can train it directly. Targeted reps means you drill short sets of the same question type until the pattern becomes obvious. So, for example, 10 clean necessary assumption questions will transform you more than 30 random logical reasoning questions. Same deal for reading comp. 5 questions where the task is to identify the function will sharpen your lens faster than a full section done aimlessly. And when we work with students, this is the exact turning point, the moment that practice stops being random and it starts being surgical. Now, structured review is a small script you run every time you miss or you feel unsure. You diagnose the question type. You paraphrase the stimulus or the passage in one sentence. You state what the correct answer had to do before you ever read it. Then you write down the trap you fell for and the rule you will apply next time around. Then you end with a quick redrill of 2 fresh questions from the same type within 24 hours. And that last piece is what locks the change into place. So let's make it concrete. Imagine that you missed a strengthened question. The clarity is your pattern is falling for answers that restate evidence instead of adding new support. The targeted reps is where you queue up 8 strengthening questions and you practice saying before the choices what kind of new fact would make the conclusion more likely. Then the structured review. After each one, you write down the rule that you will use tomorrow, such as strengthening is where we add a new bridge, not a louder version of the same plank. The next day, you do 2 more to confirm the fix. Think of this like you're tuning an instrument. Blind spots are notes that are out of tune. Random practice is strumming every string, hoping it sounds better. Weak review is listening and saying, yeah, that was off, then putting the guitar down. But on the flip side, clarity is where you name the exact string and note. Targeted reps is turning that one peg until it's just right. And structured review is playing the same riff tomorrow to make sure it stays in tune. Now, before we fix anything, we've got to have a clean snapshot of what's actually happening. So I want you to take a sheet of paper and draw 3 short lines. Label them timing, targeting, and technique. I want you to grade yourself quickly and also honestly. First, let's talk timing. Think about your last section. Were you ahead? Were you even? Or were you behind at the 10-minute, 20-minute, and 30-minute marks? So you could write it down like this. At 10 minutes, you were behind. At 20 minutes, you were even. At 30 minutes, you were rushing. And if you don't know, that right there is your first clue. From now on, I want you to note those checkpoints after every section. Because timing is not just about the clock, it's about where your energy leaks. Then we talk targeting. Ask yourself, did you choose the right questions to linger and fight out? Did you waste 3 minutes trying to brute force a question where your understanding wasn't really changing? So you could write down, for example, one sentence like, I lingered too long on hard conditionals, or I avoided dual comparative passages even though I'm decent at them. And when we work with students, simply fixing targeting, what you attempt first, what you flag, what you skip, that gives you immediate points without actually having to make you any smarter, which is a pretty cool win. Then we have technique, and this is your process for every question. Could you explain in just a single sentence what the argument said and what the correct answer had to do before you looked at the choices? If the honest answer is no, your technique is no better than guess and check with nicer words. So write down one sentence like, I didn't paraphrase, I did not anticipate, I jumped straight to the choices. Now I want you to think about the category or the mistake that hurts you most right now. If timing's the issue, your plan's going to focus on flagging and where you cut off. If targeting's the issue, your plan focuses on starting with the lowest hanging fruit and then flagging and marking faster. But if technique's the issue, your plan's going to focus on paraphrasing, anticipating, and then verifying. Now, let's talk about how to note your confidence. Next to each label, I want you to write down a number from 1 to 5 for how confident you felt. Not how you scored, just how you felt. Your timing confidence, your targeting confidence, and your technique confidence. Low confidence points to where your anxiety is stealing precious minutes away. But high confidence with low results points to a blind spot that you can fix this week. So now we've got a clear map where you're leaking time, where you're choosing the wrong battles, and where your process breaks. And everything we do going forward will help plug one of these leaks to help you break through your LSAT score plateau. So now I want to give you some structure in your studying, something predictable that you can follow every single day from now till your test, whether you're taking it in November, January, February, April, June, or beyond. I call this the LASER framework. LASER is an acronym standing for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. And this is the framework we use to create personal day-by-day study plans for our students inside the LSAT Unplugged program. And every top scorer we've worked with follows this plan, whether they know it by name or not. The first step is learning. Learning is where you get crystal clear on the concepts and strategies you're actually supposed to use. Most people think they're learning when they read a prep book or they watch a video, but that's not really learning, that's passive absorption or exposure. Learning means you can explain the idea in your own words and apply it on a real question. So when you study a question type, don't just watch somebody else solve it, try explaining it back even out loud, because if you can't teach it, you don't own it. Next is accuracy, because once you understand the concept, your goal is clean, slow, correct work. I want you to forget the clock for now. This stage is where you train yourself to think clearly. If you miss something, that's gold. That is valuable information. Every question that you get wrong is an opportunity to learn something new. And accuracy work is where we clean up your logic understanding so later, when you add speed, you're not just making the same mistakes faster. Then we've got sections, and this is where you practice timing, pacing, and stamina, but one section at a time. This is the stage where you're no longer focused on individual questions, but you're practicing your flow. You start to feel when to move on, when to double down, and how to keep your brain sharp for 35 minutes straight. Then after that is exams and endurance. This is the full test experience, simulating real conditions, full-length timing, no distractions, no pausing. And this is not about just tracking your score. It's about building the mental endurance to stay focused across all sections. Endurance is a skill that you can train. And finally, we've got review. And this is the part that almost everybody rushes or skips, but it's where improvement actually happens. It's not about checking the right answer. It's about dissecting your thought process. In other words, you're asking, why did you pick that answer? What was your prediction before reading the choices? What trap caught you? When you study that deeply, you turn your mistakes into future points. So again, learning, accuracy, sections, exams and endurance, and review. That is the LASER approach. And the beauty of this system is that it loops. You don't finish LASER once, you run through it over and over. And each loop tightens your control. 1 week, you might focus on learning and accuracy to fix logical reasoning. But the next week, you might emphasize endurance and review before you take a full practice test. Now, here's what I want you to do now. You write down the word LASER in big letters on your notes, and you leave a little space under each letter. So as we go through the rest of this class, you'll fill in what belongs in each stage for your specific plateau. And by the end, you'll have a personalized 7-day LASER loop to restart your score growth, because now you're running a system. And to be real, when your score stalls, Your first instinct might be to just take another practice test because you think to yourself, maybe I just need more exposure. Maybe I'll get lucky. Maybe the next one's going to go better. But that's like trying to fix your car by trying to drive it faster. Full practice tests are diagnostic tools. They're meant to show you where the problems are, not to fix them. But almost every student who hits a plateau starts using practice tests as their only study method. They burn through valuable hours testing, scoring, feeling frustrated, but they're not actually learning anything new. And think about it. Each full practice test takes about 2.5 hours to complete and another 2.5 hours to review properly. 5 hours in total, nearly half a workday. But if you don't do a deep review, if you just check your answers and move on, you've spent all that time just rehearsing bad habits. You've literally been training your plateau. And so when we work with students, this is usually the first thing we change. Instead of 3 or 4 full practice tests a week, we drop down to 1. Sometimes 1 every 2 weeks. The space in between those exams is where we do the real work: targeted drilling, deep review, and laser-focused sets on the exact question families that keep showing up in your misses. And here's why it works. Practice tests measure progress, but drills create progress. The people who increase from the 150s to the 170s aren't constantly testing, they're training. They treat every missed question like a clue. They'll spend 10 minutes on a single problem if it means understanding the reasoning pattern behind it. So let's make this concrete. Imagine that your logical reasoning accuracy is 70%. You take another practice test and it's still 70%. If you instead took that same time and did 5 sets of 10 questions, all from your weakest question types, and you reviewed them properly, and I mean really reviewed them, you would fix patterns that show up across every section of every test. Here's a mental model I use. Practice tests are like mirrors. They reflect what's already there. If you look in the mirror and you don't like what you see, staring longer is not going to help. You've got to change the training that happens between reflections, between practice tests. So your new rule going forward is 1 full practice test per week at most. Everything else should be focused reps, structured review, and applying the laser framework I mentioned earlier. And every time you're tempted to take a full practice test just to see, I want you to stop and ask, what exactly am I testing? If you can't answer that clearly, you're not ready for another one just yet. Now, the quiet habit that keeps scores stuck is rereading and hoping that meaning suddenly appears. You hit a dense stimulus or a long reading comp paragraph, your eyes glaze over, and you think, let me read it again, but slower this time. And that's passive reading. It feels like work, but it doesn't improve your score. Now, the difference with top scorers is they don't read more, but they decide faster. In logical reasoning, your job, your task, is to find the core claim and ask what would break it or what would make it hold. In reading comp, your task is to track the viewpoints and purposes, not every little detail. If you can't say in plain English what the author argued and what the right answer must do, you're just guessing. So I want you to switch. When you read, you paraphrase, you anticipate, and then you verify. You paraphrase the argument or the paragraph in 1 clean line. The author claims X because Y. You anticipate what the right answer must accomplish given the question stem. Maybe it's going to weaken by offering an alternate cause. Maybe it'll strengthen by adding a missing link. Maybe it's necessary by stating what the argument relies on. Only then do you verify against the choices. The choices are evidence to test your prediction, not randomly guess. Now, let's make this concrete. Let's say you read a logical reasoning argument that says a city banned ride shares and traffic got worse, so ride shares must reduce congestion. So your paraphrase here is simple. Conclusion is that the ride shares reduce congestion because traffic worsened without them. Your anticipation or prephrase for a weakened question is also simple. You show a different reason traffic got worse, like road construction or a transit strike. Now, when you go through the choices, you're not asking, do I like it? You're asking, does it introduce a plausible alternate cause? That is active reasoning. Same idea in reading comp. For example, let's say you see a paragraph quoting a critic. Passive readers just copy the details, but active readers tag the roles and the viewpoints. For example, the author sets up a claim, introduces a critic to challenge it, then offers a rebuttal. Now, a question about the quote is no longer a memory test, it's a function check. The quote's job was to illustrate the opposing view, not the author's view. Once you track that, the trap answers that mix up the voices lose their power. So I want you to build 2 tiny habits this week. First, a 1-sentence paraphrase before you look at the choices on any tricky question. Second, you've got a 1-sentence must statement before you evaluate the answers. And you say it out loud if you can. If you cannot produce both sentences, the paraphrase and the must statement, you are not yet ready to pick an answer. Give yourself 10 more seconds to clarify. That extra 10 seconds will save you several minutes of rereading. So I want you to drop the habit of reading the same lines again and again and replace it with a ritual of pre-commitment, of pre-phrasing, and you will feel the difference immediately. You're going from reading passively to reasoning actively. Now, here is the fastest way to feel progress this week. Stop treating your misses as random accidents and start treating them as members of a family. An error family is a repeating pattern that shows up across different tests and different wordings. In logical reasoning, it might be necessary versus sufficient, or causation traps, or quantifier shifts, or misreading a principle. In reading comp, it might be mixing up the author's voice with a quoted critic, missing function questions, or choosing answers that are true but not supported by the passage. Now let's find yours right now. Think back to your last 2 practice sections. Which question types or traps kept appearing in your wrong answers? Not once, but repeatedly. For example, maybe you keep picking bridge answers on necessary assumption that guarantee a bit too much. Or maybe you keep falling for reading comp answers that recycle a line you remember, but twist its job in the paragraph, becoming a distortion. For example, quote, I lose on necessary assumption by choosing guarantees, or I lose on reading comp by confusing the author's view with the quoted expert. Now, I want you to choose 1 question type to attack this week, only 1, and it should be common enough to show up often and painful enough to matter. So if you're torn between 2, pick the one you're going to see most often across tests. For example, necessary assumption is far more common than parallel flaw. Now, here's how you train it. You pick a short set of 10 to 12 questions from that type, and you keep the difficulty reasonable to start. Your goal is to see the pattern. Before you look at the choices, write down 1 line. What must the right answer do for this question type? For example, in necessary assumption, it's got to be required. If you negate it, the argument falls apart. For strengthen, it must add a new fact that makes the conclusion more likely. For function and reading comp, it's got to describe the job the sentence plays in the author's argument, not just repeat its content. Then you check the choices against your task and against your prephrase. And as you review, capture the exact trap that got you and be specific. For example, on necessary assumption, you choose an answer that's too strong but not required. Or in reading comp, you chose a true statement about the quote instead of its function in the author's structure. Now you convert that into a rule you can use tomorrow. For example, in necessary assumption, you test by negation. For function questions in reading comp, you label the voice and the job before reading the choices. And you can expect an immediate shift once you drill this. When you open up a new section, you'll start recognizing your question type on site, and you will feel that click where the stimulus or the paragraph feels familiar for the right reason. So instead of thinking to yourself, here we go again, you'll think to yourself, I know this trap and I know what the correct answer has to do. And that is the feeling of you breaking through a plateau. So commit to 1 question type for the next 3 days to drill it relentlessly, just 10, 12 questions a day. You pre-phrase first, you verify second, and you review with one sentence that you will actually use tomorrow. Now, I would like for us to do a quick 1-minute drill together to feel the difference between guessing and predicting. Your job is to say out loud, if you can, what the correct answer must do before you ever see any choices. Here is the short argument. A city banned rideshare cars for 3 months. During that time, average commute times increased by 10 minutes. Therefore, allowing rideshares reduces commute times. So your task is to prephrase for a weakened question. What kind of new fact would make that conclusion less likely to be true? Say it in one clean sentence. Don't even think about answer choices just yet. Think about the job the right answer must do. So here, for example, is one strong prephrase. We offer a different reason that commute times went up that has nothing to do with rideshares. For example, major road construction started that month, or the subway had repeated outages, or schools reopened and traffic volume spiked. Any one of those would weaken the claim that rideshares were the cause. Now, notice what we just did. We didn't read through 5 different traps. We created a prephrase. Now, if you saw the choices, you would scan for alternative causes and ignore anything that only restates the evidence or talks about a different metric like rider satisfaction. Now we lock it in with a second quick pass. Same stimulus, new question type. Now we think about it as a necessary assumption question. What must be true for the city's conclusion to hold? Here is a solid must or requirement. Nothing else changed in a way that would affect commute times during the ban. If you negate that and say something else did change that affects commutes, the argument falls apart. That is how you test necessity. Now, here is one more variation. We take the same argument, but make it a strengthening question. What kind of fact would make the conclusion more likely? For example, a good strengthener would show that in other cities where rideshares were introduced, commute times fell while all other conditions were constant. Or they show that when the ban ended in this city, commute times went back down. That adds a new bridge between rideshares and commute time. That is anticipation. That is prephrasing. One sentence about the job the right answer must do, then a quick scan to verify. And when you practice like this, the choices stop feeling random and they start feeling like evidence for or against your prediction. So I want you to use this exact approach on your next 10 logical reasoning questions that feel slippery. You predict first, then you verify. Now let's talk about time. People feel like they never have enough time on the LSAT. But most people think that timing just means finishing the section on time. But that's only one clock. There are actually 3 different clocks on the LSAT. The global clock is 35 minutes for a section. You're watching that number tick down and you're hoping you can get to the last question before time's up. And that's fine, but it's not where most people lose points. The local clock is the one running inside each question. You have an average of roughly 1 minute and 25 seconds per question across the LSAT for the 75 scored questions, the 100 total. So you'll start reading a single question and you'll see the seconds quietly disappearing while you try to make sense of the argument. And you might tell yourself, I've already spent this long, might as well finish. But that's sunk cost thinking. The LSAT doesn't care how long you've been on a question. It only cares whether you get it right and whether you have time left for the others. Now, the emotional clock is the one almost nobody talks about, but it starts ticking the second you realize, I don't know this. That's when your heart rate goes up, your breathing gets shallow, and suddenly you're reading faster, but you're understanding less. And that emotional clock steals precious minutes from your total without you even realizing it. And every student who hits a plateau is secretly losing time to the emotional clock. Now, here's how top scorers manage all 3 clocks. They use timing checkpoints. Around the 10-minute mark, they'll pause for just half a second and they'll check their progress. They'll say to themselves, I've done 9 questions and I'm on track, or I'm behind by 2, but I'm still feeling calm. Then they decide whether to slightly pick up the pace or to stay steady. They're intentional about it. They also know when to skip questions. They're not waiting until panic hits. For example, they have pre-written rules like, if I'm not eliminating by 45 seconds, I mark and I move on. Or if I read the stimulus once and it still feels fuzzy, I flag and I skip. That's how they protect their local clock. They know when to fold, just like in poker. And then to control the emotional clock, they practice tiny resets. 1 deep breath, 1 sentence in their head, next question, clean slate. That's their mantra. And it's simple, but it stops the spiral of panic before it starts. And that single line often saves our students 3 to 4 questions worth of time in a single section. So here is your drill for the week. On your next time section, mark down what question you're on at 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or 30 minutes, and write down calm or rushed or lost next to each checkpoint. Then afterward, you look for patterns. For example, do you always get flustered around the 15-minute mark? Do you always hit a wall at the final 5 questions? Those aren't random. That's your emotional timing pattern revealing itself. And once you can see the pattern, you can fix it. Because timing isn't about reading faster, it's about making better decisions earlier. The best LSAT test takers don't necessarily finish every question, but they finish strong on the right ones. And that's how they break through their plateaus. So let's pause for a second. We've talked through how to spot the real cause of a plateau, how to group your errors into families, how to pre-phrase before you eliminate, and how to manage your timing. So you might recognize yourself in a few of these examples, and you might even be thinking to yourself, I can see what I've been doing wrong, but how do I know what I should do next? And that's where personalization becomes the multiplier. Because all the frameworks in the world don't mean anything if you're applying them to the wrong problems. You could have perfect timing, perfect endurance, but still be drilling questions that don't move the needle. And so when we work with our students one-on-one, the first thing we do is run a short diagnostic on their last 2 practice tests to collect data. We look for patterns. Which question types take the longest, which ones are most often guessed, and which ones lead to multiple rereads. And in about just 15 minutes of analysis, the blind spots become obvious, and we see the 2 or 3 exact things that have been holding back students for months. And that's honestly what I want for you too. I want you to experience the moment where everything clicks and you stop wasting time on what doesn't move the needle. And so if you want help building that custom plan, you can book a free private LSAT tutoring lesson with me. There's a link right below this video, unpluggedprep.com/start. It's totally free. No pressure. But if you want to shortcut the trial and error part, grab that free session with me. I'll give you a personalized plan of attack that fits your score, your schedule, and your study style. So let's talk about how top scorers think and how they read. They don't read faster, they decide faster. They treat questions like jobs with a task to perform. Every stimulus, every passage, every answer choice has a role to play. Start with logical reasoning, for example. Before they even look at the choices, top scorers name the argument's job to be done in one line, based on the question stem. For weaken, they ask, what would make that claim less likely? For necessary, what must be true or the claim falls apart? For strengthen, what new fact would make the claim more likely? They create a target. Then the choices are just evidence to test against that target. They also treat trap answers as employees applying for the wrong job. An answer might be smart, interesting, maybe even technically true, but if it doesn't do the job the question asked for, it's out. And that discipline is what keeps you from getting tempted by familiar words or a confident tone. That single habit, judging by the task to be done, not by the vibe, not by random guessing or emotion, will save you more points than any fancy trick. Now let's talk about reading comp. Top scorers do not try to remember everything. They track voices and function, meaning who is speaking here? Is it the author, a critic, a researcher? We ask, what is the sentence doing? Is it making a claim? Is it giving evidence? Is it providing background? Is it offering a counterpoint? Because once you label the viewpoint and the job to be done, most reading comp questions become role checks. Function questions ask, what job did that sentence play? Inference questions ask, given the author's role and stance, what else follows? The trap answers blur the viewpoints or they distort things. They rely on small, repeatable prompts. In logical reasoning, for example, top scorers ask, what is the claim? What is the job to be done? In reading comp, top scorers ask, why is this sentence here? And they're always asking, what must the correct answer accomplish? Now let's ground this with a quick example. In logical reasoning, we might have an argument saying, a study shows that people who drink green tea have fewer colds, so green tea prevents illness. So the one-line paraphrase here is pretty straightforward. There are fewer colds among tea drinkers, therefore green tea is preventative. For a weakener, the target is to provide an alternate cause. Maybe tea drinkers also exercise more, sleep more, or they're older and less exposed to germs from a daycare. Now, when you read the choices, you're scanning for an alternate cause, not for what sounds medical or what sounds impressive. Let's take reading comp. Suppose you have a passage where the author introduces a new archaeological method, quotes a critic who doubts its accuracy, then presents recent results that align with independent dating techniques. If you're asked about the critic's quote, the job is to present the opposing view. If you're asked about the final paragraph, the job is to rebut skepticism by pointing to corroborating evidence. Your job is not to recall specific details or lines. Your job is to verify the role. Top scorers are also okay with flagging and skipping. They don't fight every single battle in the moment. If their predictions are unclear after a minute, they flag it and move on, trusting they'll come back later with a fresh perspective. And that confidence comes from a particular method. They predict, then they verify. They label, then they choose. You can only skip confidently when you know you have a system to return with. So I want you to adopt one mantra for the week. You predict the job, meaning you prephrase, then you judge the fit. You evaluate how well your prephrase matches a given choice. If you can't state the job to be done in one sentence, you want to give yourself 10 more seconds to clarify. But if you're still unsure, you flag it because you've got to protect your time. Your goal isn't necessarily to know everything. Your goal is to know exactly what you're asking the right answer to do and to hold every single choice to that standard. Now let's talk about necessary versus sufficient. That is the single most common pattern that quietly caps scores in logical reasoning. You see a tempting, powerful answer and you think to yourself, that would definitely make the argument work. Then you pick it on a necessary assumption question and you get burned because you chose a sufficient assumption when they were asking for a necessary assumption. Now here is the clean distinction. For a necessary assumption question, they're asking you for what the argument needs just to work. If you remove it, the argument falls apart. Doesn't have to be dramatic, just has to be required. On the flip side, a sufficient assumption is different. If it were true, it would guarantee the conclusion. And it can be stronger than what the author actually assumed. So we have tests that we can apply here. For necessary assumption, we use the negation test. You gently negate the answer and see if the argument falls apart. If it does, the original was required. But if the argument still technically works, then it wasn't necessary. On the flip side, for sufficient assumption, you use the plug-in test. Pretend the answer was 100% true or guaranteed, and you ask, would this force the conclusion to be true? If yes, it's sufficient. Now, be on the lookout for traps. On necessary questions, strong language is often wrong precisely because it over-guarantees. Words like all, every, must, or the only could be a red flag. On the flip side, necessary answers often sound modest. They'll use phrases like at least some, tends to, or usually. They protect the argument rather than supercharging it. But on sufficient questions, the stronger statements are often right. So in other words, the very strength you should distrust on necessary is what you should be looking for on sufficient. So let's make it concrete with an example. Suppose you had an argument saying people who follow the Mediterranean diet have lower heart disease rates, so the diet reduces heart disease. Here's a necessary assumption candidate. No other difference between the groups explains the lower rates. Let's say we negate that, saying some other difference explains the lower rates. If that were true, the argument falls apart. That means the original statement is necessary. Now here's a sufficient candidate. Anyone who follows the Mediterranean diet will not develop heart disease. If that were true, it would guarantee the conclusion, but it's far stronger than required. Great for sufficient, but overkill for necessary. Now, conditional language adds another layer. If A then B means A is sufficient for B and B is necessary for A. On necessary questions, answers that accidentally flip or reverse or negate the conditional relationship are classic traps. So if the stimulus relies on a statement like, if test prep habits improve, scores rise, a necessary idea might be, scores won't rise unless habits improve, or improved habits are required for a score increase. A too strong sufficient idea would be, if habits improve, scores will always rise by 10 points. And that last one guarantees way more than the author needs. So here is a quick 3-step routine for the week. The first step is to label the stem before you read the choices. You say necessary or sufficient out loud so your brain knows which test to apply. Then step 2, you write down a 1-line target. For necessary, you ask, what must be true or this falls apart? For sufficient, you ask, what would, if true, guarantee the conclusion? Then your third step is to test aggressively. For necessary, you negate contenders and see if the argument breaks. For sufficient, you plug contenders into the argument and you see if they bridge all the gaps without adding new claims the conclusion doesn't require. In other words, you want an elegant solution to guarantee the conclusion. Now, here are some common traps to expect. You might see, for example, recycled evidence that restates a premise instead of addressing the gap. You might see causation swaps that say A and B correlate when the argument needs A to require B. And on sufficient, you might look for answers that feel close, but they leave one tiny gap unbridged. And those are wrong because almost guarantees is still a miss, not the same as actually guaranteeing. So as an exercise, as a drill, you could try doing a 10-question set of pure necessary assumption questions. You aim to use the negation test on every single pick. Then tomorrow, you do a 10-question sufficient assumption set and you practice looking for the strong bridge that you usually avoid. Then on the third day, you mix 5 of each type, 5 necessary, 5 sufficient. You mix them up, you label the stem first, and you use the appropriate test based on the question type. Necessary questions, you're looking for protective and modest. For sufficient, you look for bold and complete choices. Next, we'll talk about reading comp. So most people think of reading comp as a memory test. They try to remember every detail, every name, every date, but then the questions come and it all becomes a big mess. Now, top scorers don't necessarily remember more, but they track 2 things with ruthless consistency: who is speaking and what job each sentence is doing. We start off with viewpoints. Every paragraph has viewpoints. Could be the author, could be a critic, could be some researchers or scholars or a historical figure being quoted. Now you want to look for multiple viewpoints where the author says one thing, The critic says another. You want to be careful to distinguish who said what, because you might want to pick an answer that's true for the critic, but they were asking about the author. You don't want to assign it to the wrong person. Now we also look at function. Every sentence has a job. It could be introducing the topic, stating the author's claim, giving evidence, offering a counterpoint, conceding a limitation, or wrapping up with implications. When you label the jobs, you stop asking, what did it say? And you start asking, why is it here? When you do this, function questions become straightforward. Inference questions become easier because you already know how each part supports the whole. So let's talk about the most common trap that you'll see here. Answers that are true, but don't fit the correct role. They might quote a line that you remember, and they sound correct, but they describe the wrong job or the wrong viewpoint. And the cure here is pretty straightforward. Before you look at the choices, you say one line to yourself. This sentence's job is X, spoken by Y. Then you scan for the choice that names that job. If no choice names it, it means that you misread the role. So you've got to go back to the paragraph and re-tag the voice. And your pacing is going to change when you read this way. You're not going to linger on every fact. You'll move faster through background, you'll slow down on claims and counters, and you'll pay close attention when voices switch. You're not going to panic when the passage gets technical because you'll keep asking the same two questions. Who is speaking and why is this here? So if you're struggling with reading comp, I want you to build a quick drill into your week. Take a single reading comp paragraph and force yourself to label every sentence with the viewpoint and the job in under 1 minute. Then you answer 2 function questions about that paragraph only. And you're going to notice something. Even without remembering every detail, you'll be able to answer with confidence because you'll understand the structure. Now, when a question asks for the best title or the primary purpose, I want you to think about the blueprint that you just mapped out. The best title will reflect the author's main claim and the tension the passage resolves, not some narrow example from paragraph 2. Now let's talk about skipping strategies, because most people hate hearing this, but it's true. You don't have to answer every question to get a great score. In fact, trying to do that is often the reason your score doesn't move. The students who finally break through their plateau learn one crucial habit. They skip early, they skip often, and they skip strategically. Think of it like triage in an emergency room. Doctors are not going to spend 20 minutes on a patient with a stubbed toe when others are in real danger. They assess quickly, they prioritize, and they move on. And you've got to have that same instinct on the LSAT. Every question is asking for your attention, but not every question deserves it right now. So here's the rule. You do 2 fast passes through every section. The first pass is the low-hanging fruit. These are the questions that click for you instantly, the ones where your first read makes sense and your paraphrase feels solid. You take those on now. The second pass is the questions that are more medium difficulty, where they feel doable, but you know they're a bit time-consuming. So you come back to those with whatever time is left, and you have a calmer mind, a fresh perspective. Everything else, you flag it, you move on to protect your focus. And flagging and moving on does not mean that you're giving up. It means you're saving them for later when your brain's a bit more warmed up. And we see this with our students over and over. They skip 1 or 2 early traps, they get to the easier questions faster, and their scores jump immediately without having to learn a single new concept. And you can build your personal skip triggers right now. For example, if I'm not eliminating at least one choice by 45 seconds in, I flag it and I move on. Or if I reread the stimulus and I still don't have a clear conclusion or task, I flag it and I move on. Or if my gut says, maybe if I can figure this out, if I read it again, that's my cue to skip. Now, skipping is saying, I control this test, it doesn't control me. And you would be amazed how much calmer you feel when you stop trying to brute force every hard question on the first pass. So imagine that you're 12 minutes into logical reasoning, You've done 9 questions and you hit a parallel flaw question that looks like it would take 2 minutes to diagram. Old you would grind it out and panic about time later. But new you skips it instantly, finishes 4 more questions in that same time, then comes back at the end with 3 minutes left and a fresh perspective. You just traded 1 stressful question for 4 confident ones. And by the way, same logic applies to reading comp. If the passage feels like molasses, it's super dense science or art theory that drains your energy, you flag it, you move on to the next passage and come back if there's time. Because 1 easy passage early could be worth 2 hard ones later when your focus is gone. So here is a mini drill for you to try. Next time you do a timed section, mark every single question that you would normally feel tempted to wrestle with for more than a minute. Then you look at your score afterward. Chances are you got more right overall, even though you did less. And that is the paradox of skipping. Skipping is a strategy. And the more you practice it, the more control you feel because you're no longer reacting to the test, you are managing it. Now let's talk about review, because most people glance at the right answer, they shrug and they move on, but review should change what you do on the very next question. And the fastest way to make that happen is a simple loop I use called the 5 whys. You start with 1 question that you missed or you were unsure on, and you write the outcome in 1 line. For example, I chose B, the answer was E. Now you ask why. Because I thought B connected the premise to the conclusion. Why did I think that? Because the wording sounded like a bridge. Why did the wording fool me? Because I didn't state what the right answer had to do before I read the choices. Why didn't I state it? Because I felt rushed and I skipped at the paraphrase. Why did I feel rushed? Because I was behind at minute 20 and I tried to make up the time on a hard question. So notice what just happened here. In 5 short whys, you moved from a vague mistake to a specific fixable behavior, skipping the paraphrase under time pressure. That is not a concept problem or understanding problem. That is a process problem, and that process is trainable right now. You've got to turn the root cause into a rule that you will use on the next question. For example, before reading the choices, write down 1 must sentence. For example, in necessary assumption, you write down what must be true or the argument falls. For weaken, you write the kind of new fact that would hurt the link. You keep it to 1 line only, short and concrete. If the rule is longer than a text message, it's not a rule that you would actually use. Now, you add a trigger so the rule shows up when you need it. For example, if I catch myself rereading the stimulus once with no clearer idea, I pause for 10 seconds and I write the must sentence. If I hit 45 seconds with nothing eliminated, I flag it and I move on. Triggers are how you beat the emotional clock. They remove the need to negotiate with yourself under stress. Then you lock it in with a re-drill. You find 2 new questions of the same type and you run the new rule immediately, preferably within 24 hours. You do the must sentence first, then you evaluate the choices against it. If you miss again, you run the 5 whys again, and this is how you tighten the loop. You diagnose, you make a rule, you note the trigger, and you re-drill. That is the engine of improvement. Let's do another example. Let's say it's logical reasoning strengthening questions. You picked an answer that repeated a premise. Why? Because it felt relevant. Why did relevance seem enough? Because you didn't define what would actually strengthen. Why didn't you define it? Because you were focused on finishing, not thinking. Why were you focused on finishing? Because you were behind after a time sink question earlier. Why did that earlier question become a time sink? Because you didn't skip when your 45-second trigger hit. The root cause, there was no skip trigger, and there was no must sentence. So you write the rule. On strengthen, the correct answer adds a new fact that makes the conclusion more likely. Recycled evidence does nothing. So you write the trigger. If I can't say the new fact in 1 line, I pause and I write it before looking at the choices. So I want you to re-drill 2 strengthening questions tonight and demand that the correct choice adds, not repeats. And by the way, reading comp works the same way. Let's say you missed a function question. Why? Because you picked a choice that restated the sentence. Why did you accept restatement? Because you didn't label the sentence's job while you were reading. Why didn't you label it? Because you were trying to remember details instead of roles. Why were you doing that? Because you thought reading comp is about memory. Why did you think that? Because that's how you were taught in school. The root cause, you're reading for facts instead of roles. So write down the rule. Your job is to tag each paragraph with a viewpoint and a job, then answer the function by role, not by content. So write down the trigger. If a question asks about a sentence's role, I say the role out loud before I look at the choices. Then you redrill 2 function questions with this exact routine. And I want you to keep your review sheet tight and repeatable. For each miss, capture 4 lines only. The question type, the root cause, the new rule, and what you're going to redrill next time. That's it. You are building a playbook you can actually run under pressure. A month from now, that playbook will read like a list of your old traps and the counters that beat them. If you adopt just this one habit, 5 honest whys, 1 sentence rule, 1 clear trigger, 2 immediate redrills, you will feel your studying change within days. You won't be guessing what to fix. You'll be running the same tiny loop again and again until the bad habit has nowhere left to hide. That is how plateaus break. Now, if you want your score to move, you've got to have data, but not just more data, the right data. Most students track everything except the things that matter. They'll log their hours, they'll log the questions they do, which test number they took, but none of that tells you what to do tomorrow. The only data worth tracking is the kind that changes your next action. So here is the simple rule. I want you to track the causes, not your wins. Hours studied is a win, but the question type that you missed is a cause. Number of pages that you did is a win, but the reason you missed questions is a cause. So I want you to double down on the causes of your mistakes so that you can avoid them next time around. I want you to use a 4-column tracker you can fill in fast after every set. This could be a Google Sheet, a Google Doc, a physical notebook, I don't care. Your first column is the question type. Be specific here. Necessary assumption, strengthen, parallel, or in reading comp, function questions, viewpoint questions, not just logical reasoning or reading comp. The second column is time. How long did the question take? If it's a section, write down the average time per question. Column 3, your confidence level on a scale of 1 to 5. And not how confident you feel now, how you felt when you picked the question or the answer. Column 4, what is the root cause of your mistake? This should be one short phrase. Misread conditional, fell for strong language and necessary assumption, blurred viewpoints in reading comp, didn't paraphrase, panicked and rushed, skipped the trigger. That's it. 4 columns. If you can't fill it out in under a minute, it's too complicated. You want to build a dashboard that you will actually use. Now, what should you ignore? Ignore total hours studied, total practice tests completed, and vague notes like careless mistake. None of that matters. There is no such thing as a careless mistake on the LSAT because there is a miss in your process hiding behind those words. Careless means I didn't paraphrase, or I chose based on content, not role, or I exceeded 45 seconds and refused to skip the question. Name the process until you can fix it. If you just call it careless, it will keep coming back to bite you. Now, how do you use this data tomorrow? Read across your root cause column and circle the top 2 phrases that repeat. Those are your themes for the week. For example, if strong language and necessary assumption shows up 3 times, I want you to do a 10-question set of those tomorrow and apply the negation test on every single pick. Now, data on timing changes your pacing decisions. If your average time goes too long on parallel or in long science passages, you pre-label them as second pass items, meaning those are ones you should flag and skip and come back later. That is simply being strategic. You grab the points that you can take quickly and you push the times things to later when your brain is warmed up and you've already locked up the easy points. The confidence data exposes the silent killers. High confidence wrong answer means you are systematically fooled by a pattern. That's great because now you know where to hunt. Low confidence right answer means you're burning time to get to a result that you could have reached faster with a cleaner method. Both of these are fixable once you see them. And I want you to do a 5-minute weekly review. Open your tracker, scan for repeats, and write down one sentence for each theme, the rule you will apply next week. For example, on necessary assumption, go for more modest language and test by negation. Or in reading comp, label the viewpoint before answering function questions. Or at 45 seconds, if I cannot eliminate anything, I flag it and move on. And one more thing, by the way, I want you to create a tiny wins line at the top of the tracker and note one thing that improved this week. For example, I pre-phrased 7 out of 10 logical reasonings, or my reading comp function accuracy was 80%. From now on, if a data point doesn't change tomorrow's plan, you don't track it. But if it does, you capture it in those 4 columns and you act on it within 24 hours. It's simple, repeatable, and practical, and that's how you turn numbers into points. By the way, folks, I will be doing these classes every day at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for the foreseeable future. If you guys like these sessions, if you'd like my help, of course, please leave a comment with requests for topics to cover in future classes. And if you want me to talk through your situation with you personally, you can book a free LSAT tutoring lesson with me at unpluggedprep.com/start. Link below the video here in the description. I'll see you all tomorrow, same time. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.